Friends, we were discussing about Shaka rulers. Shaka rulers came in conflict with Satavahanas in central India. Nahapana from the Kshatraya lineage, and that's one of the lineages of the Shakas who were there in western India, is mentioned as Nambanus in the Periplus. He's said to have driven Satavahanas out of the Nasik region and got in conflict with the Satavahana ruler Gautami Putra Satkarni. Evidence of his coins being restruck by Satavahana rulers, especially Gautami Putra Satkarni, also gives us an idea of a continued feud between them. Nasik inscription of the Gautami Putra confirms Nahapana's eventual defeat. Most well-known Shaka ruler was, of course, Rudradaman, who was there in 150 CE. He exercised his control over Sindh, Gujarat, Kutch, Rajasthan, Konkan, Narmada, Kathiawar and Western Deccan region. He was famous for repairing the Sudarshan Lake that you must be aware of in the Kathiawar region, which had been first constructed by the Mauryas. His inscription, incidentally, is in chaste Sanskrit. His name also indigenized. It appears that the Shakas were now adapting themselves to the Indian way of life. He seemed to have defeated Satavahana ruler, but he did not kill him, possibly because his daughter was married to him. The next group of kings that we are going to discuss are Indo-Parthians or Pahlavas. Towards the close of the 1st century BCE, a line of kings from Iran with Iranian names, that is Pahlavas, it gained control of western region. They pushed Shakas down further to western India. Best known ruler was Gondophares, who ruled in the 1st century CE. To his court came Saint Thomas. We are familiar with Saint Thomas, through whom India first came in contact with Christianity. Parthians, like Shakas, were assimilated within the Indian society. Indo-Parthian power broke with the advent of UHEs in this area. Now discussing about UHEs or Kushanas, among the Central Asian nomadic warlike groups that entered Indian subcontinent, one to be remembered are the UHEs. They are referred to in the Chinese annals of the Han dynasty, Qian Han Shu and Hao Han Shu. They were known to have deflected in this area after the Hans created the Great Wall, and now they fought against the Indo-Greeks and then the Shakas. By 1st century CE, the UHE chief Kujala Cadaphysus was able to unite the 5 tribes, cross Hindu Kush mountains and established himself at Kabul and Kashmir. The most famous Kushana ruler was Kanishka, who was there in 78 CE. He was of the Cadaphysus lineage. I'll talk about it in some detail when I take up this subsection on the Kushanas. But apart from the Kushanas, in other parts of the country, because we are still discussing the subcontinent, Kalinga was under Mahameghavans. Kharavel was an important ruler in the 1st century BCE. The Hathi Gumfa inscription engraved on Udaygiri hills near Bhubaneswar gave us an idea about the rulers and the rule in Kalinga region. We also get to know that many of them were followers of Jain faith and claimed to have conquered Magad, Pandyans in the south and even fought the Indo-Greeks. What was there in central India? In central India, Satavahanas came up to rule from the 1st century BCE. With that commenced the state formation in central India. Center of power at this time was Pratishthan. They were also referred to as Andhras in the Puranas, so there's a possibility that they actually came from Andhra region and then they moved into the Western Deccan. However, some of the historians feel that they originally belonged to Western Deccan and then they kind of moved on into other areas, especially the east. The very famous founder of Satavahanas was Simuk, and I just discussed about the Satavahana-Shak conflict. And amongst the important rulers were Gautami Putra Satkarni, Vashishti Putra Satkarni, Sri Satkarni, and after death of Rudradaman, Satavahanas regained their territory and ruled over Kathiawar. They are supposed to have followed Brahminical order. 3rd century actually saw the gradual weakening of power and gradually they declined. Abiras followed them in northwestern Deccans and Ikshvakus in the Andhra Desh. This is a picture. I'm just showing this picture. I'll be discussing all this in detail in my next lecture. This is of Kanheri caves, where there's an inscription. And this is an interesting inscription because it gives us an idea of an existing political alliance between the Shaka and the Satvanas. It was believed that Vashishtiputra Satkarni was actually defeated by Rudradaman, but Rudradaman did not kill him. On the other hand, he actually worked out a political alliance by giving away his daughter in marriage to him, and that is what is referred to in this particular inscription that I talked about of the queen of the illustrious Satkarni Vashishtaputra, descendant from the race of Kardamak kings and daughter of Makshatrapa Rudra of the confidential minister Satkarni, and goes on to say that the wedding had taken place. So Kanheri inscription gives us that kind of sense of political alliance. Coming down to south, friends, I have already given you detailed lectures on Sangam period. Just a quick reminder that we have texts like Ettutukai, Pattapattu, Tolikapayam, and later texts like Shilapadakaram and Mani Mekhalai to enlighten us on this particular period. So I'm not getting into details on this. I'm going to come on the second, our subsection, the second important aspect of what I would like to familiarize with you with, and that is on Kushana polity, one of the important dynasties of the post-Mauryan time, especially in north and northwestern area, were the Kushans. Who were Kushans? That's a big question. Kushans were a branch of UHE tribe who were principally responsible for controlling Bactria and expelling the Shakas from the region towards the south. According to a Chinese source, Kujalak Adiphasis was one of the chiefs of the 5 tribes, and he brought all of them together. The earliest possible Kushana ruler was Myos, who not only ruled over Bactria but also north part of Oxus, which is now called the Amudaryar area. There was a gradual transition of the UHE community from Central Asian horse riding nomadic people to adopting a sedentary lifestyle. That is very, very important because we see a shift from a tribal kind of an existence to one that would help in creation of a mighty empire. The expansion of Kushana power was because of political and military success of early rulers like Kujalak Adiphasis, Vimak Adiphasis, Kanishka I, Hovishka I, and Vasudev I. If the chronology has to be taken into account, they were there for nearly 5 centuries in context South Asian history from 200 BCE to 300 CE. But Kanishka was one of the most important rulers, and in Indian context, they are more famous for their rule in the early centuries of the Common Era. Chinese accounts tell us about the fact that Kujalak Adiphasis had created a strong ruling base for himself as early as 64 CE. There was final breakup of the Kushana Empire that would have happened only around the 3rd century CE after the Vasudev rule by Vasudev. Now, among the sources of Kushanas, though I have mentioned there are other sources, we do refer to Manu Smriti and other sources also, but a very, very important source of Kushana is the Rabatak inscription. Here is a picture of the Rabatak inscription, and I'm going to spend a minute or so discussing that. The second picture is on the area where the Rabatak had been found, inscription had been found, obviously in Afghanistan. This is an inscription which is inscribed on a stone with a text written in Bactrian language and Greek script. It was found in 1993 at Rabatak near Surkotai in Afghanistan. The inscription relates to the rule of the Kushana ruler, especially the Kanishka I, gives us remarkable clues on the genealogy of the Kushana dynasty. It may have dated around 2nd century CE. It was found during the digging of a trench atop a Kushana site along with other sculptural remains. An Englishman took a picture and then sent it to the British Museum, where later Joe Cribb worked on it and found out it was almost a gold mine for all the archaeologists. For a very long time, friends, when I was a student like you are, we thought that Kushans had two lines, the Cadaphysus line and the Kanishka line. It was this particular inscription that clarified that they all were the same line. Kanishka is in this inscription possibly was in a Devakul in that area, the temple of the kings, and where Kanishka talks about his genealogy, and that's how we get to know that they all were interconnected. Presently, this particular inscription is placed in Kabul Museum. This is a map. The next is a map of the Kushana Empire. You can get a sense of it. Fairly a large, humongous empire covering northwestern part of India, Indian subcontinent, but stretching right to Central Asia and seem to have its contacts well into West Asia as well. I would like to discuss certain features of Kushana polity. One of the important aspects of Kushanas is their transition from a tribal setup to a monarchical setup. This can be reflected in the assumption of very grandiose titles, which was not the case with the Mauryan rulers. Mauryan rulers like Ashoka, he was satisfied with a very simple title, Raja. Ashok, he's Raja of Magad. But as we move on to the Kushana period, we find a change coming up. We find gradually the rulers start taking titles like Shahanushahi, and later on there will be many other titles, grandiose, long-sounding titles coming up. An important aspect of Kushana polity was their claim of divinity, which they did so by presenting themselves in inscriptions and coins as Devaputra. They called themselves Devaputra, or son of God. Kings were portrayed on the obverse of their coins with a halo behind their head. Scholars assume that Kushana's overt association with divinity was an act of their transition to royalty. You see, they were tribal people and they were gradually turning into monarchical system, and so they wanted to gain they wanted a popular acceptance of their existence. Both Shakars and Kushanas strengthened the idea of divine origin of kingship. This title was adopted by Kushanas from the Chinese, who called their kings the son of heaven. It was naturally used in India to legitimize the royal authority. We also find the influence getting extended even to the works of the lawmakers of the day. For instance, Manu asks his people to respect the king even if he is a child, because he is a great god ruling in form of human beings. So the idea of divinity was coming up, but it was not something that would be, but none of the kings would be directly called the descendants of God. This is a coin. We look at the picture. These are Kushan coins, which give us a fairly good sense of royalty, very grandiose in appearance. We also have yet another way in which the Kushanas strengthened their divine titles by creating the Devakulas, or temples to honor the kings, with which started also the cult of the kings. Devakulas were dynastic sanctuaries wherein the statues of the dead rulers were housed. Term Devakula is recorded in inscriptions of colossal image of Bhima Cadaphysus. We also have reference to the repair of Devakula of the grandfather of Huvishka during the reign of the latter. We have example of, possible example of Devakulas, the ruins of Devakulas at Math, which is close to Mathura. So the possibility that they continued this practice right into the Indian subcontinent also. But otherwise, Devakula was construction of Devakula was an important practice in Bactrian region, where the term used for Devakula is Bogala now. It's rare in India, and Kushan may have brought in this particular practice from outside. They have definitely brought it from outside, and as Romila Thapa tells us, this was probably an attempt on part of the migrants to establish their authority in an Indian setup. According to R.S. Sharma, it has been suggested that this system was taken over from the Romans on the banks of the Tiber River. So what we find with the Kushanas, they're assimilating practices all around they went. Look at this next picture. This is Kanishka's headless statue. It gives us an idea of what kind of images must have been placed in Devakula. But along with that, this also gives us an idea of Kushanas being very good horsemen. In fact, we look up to Kushanas for introducing the concept of cavalry within India. It's not that horses were not known, horses were known throughout, but they used to be yoked to a chariot, to a rath. Now, with the Kushans, we find a change in the military strategy where the mounted warrior and the horse would become one unit. So they would be sitting on the horse and fighting their wars. This is a very, very interesting new concept that was introduced by the Kushanas in the Indian subcontinent. Kushanas followed a hierarchical feudatory order. We have a system where Kushanas, we just mentioned they are tribal people. They did not have a knowledge of administrative setup. But once they entered different terrains, they started adopting their own feudatory organizations. The Kushanas, they adopted, as I mentioned, pompous titles of the kings or the Shahnushahi, which gives us an idea that they collected their tributes from many small princes. So they entered a system and they imposed themselves on that without really destroying the foundations of the system. There was an assumption of not just the titles, but there was also certain other practices that they carried on, for instance, that of dual kingship. The empire was divided into numerous satrapies, and each placed under the rule of a satrap who would be called Kshatrapa, and this is a trend that they adopted from the Shakas. Some curious practices such as hereditary dual rule, that is two kings ruling in the same region, was also begun in Indian context, though I would say it did not seem to have gained a very solid ground here. We have some examples of it. For instance, the rule by father and son. It was intended that one would be Kshatrapa, the other would be Mahakshatrapa, and this practice continued for some time. It did not carry on for too long. Kshatrapas exercised their power through military officers known as Dandanayaks and Mahadandanayaks, who seem to have occupied an important position and Kushana polity, and interestingly, these offices carry on to the Gupta rule as well. We can get a sense that their rule may not have been as centralized, say, as the Mauryas, but at the same time, an attempt towards that centralization was also there in order to maintain power of the new, conquered people and the new territories. It became very, very essential. A question that lurks in our mind is how powerful were these Kshatrapas? Were they the vanquished chiefs? Were they reinstated as governors? Well, the impression that we get from very preliminary understanding of the polity of this time, or the kind of limited information that we have, is that they were like governors. They were probably defeated and reinstated. They may be passing on certain revenue to the Kushanas. They may be ruling on behalf of the Kushana rulers, but they were not really displaced in entirety. Kushanas needed administrators themselves. They had a huge empire which was divided, as I earlier mentioned, into 5 or 7 satrapies, and they needed a whole lot of governors and administrative officers to help them. The Kshatrapas then would be like intermediaries between the people at the ground level and the king on the other side, the Kushana kings on the other side. One institution that continued well into the Kushana period and was not there with the Shakas was that of the village headmanship. They were referred to as Gramikas or Graminis in the Mauryan territory, in the Mauryan sources. They continue to be very important. The reason is very obvious. Ultimately, revenue collection would happen through this particular institution of village headmanship, and we have references to them in the records of the Kushanas also, and they seem to have exercised considerable personal influence. Now, Kushanas also had a very interesting practice. They introduced a practice of giving away monetary gifts or Akshanivi grants. System of Akshanivi donations came up during this time, and it gives us a clue to the revenue system of the Kushanas. Akshanivi was a system of monetary grants given away in perpetuity. Under the Kushanas, this system was characterized by giving away cash deposits to a religious body after collecting these as revenues. In other words, a particular area would be earmarked, that this is an area which would be used for collection of revenue. The revenue would be taken from there, and that would be given to a Buddhist monastery or a temple or some religious organization or any other organization the king chose to. But the grant went on in the name of the king generally, and generally it was a cash grant. We have an example. A Mathura stone inscription of Huvishk makes a reference to the gift of 500 Puranas under the Akshanivi grant. It was only under the Guptas that the system was characterized by giving away the land also forever. Now, land was not given, at least under the Kushanas, only revenue collected from that land was then passed on to that particular religious organization. It was probably under Kushanas that this practice then got a little extended in other terrains as well. What is the significance of Akshanivi? Akshanivi was clearly related to land revenue, but the practice meant a great deal of loss of revenue to the state. And we are forced to wonder, why should king do that? You would also be thinking about it. In my opinion, the very fact that the king was giving away Akshanivi grant, it was his way of getting acceptance amongst people to whom he did not belong originally. Of course, the later Kushan rulers had become highly Indianized. They were very much a part of the Indian terrain, but the early Kushan rulers needed some kind of acceptance. So this was one way of getting that acceptance. And from our point of view, what becomes very, very evident, friends, is that revenue at that time was possibly collected in cash. So once again, my old point that I brought in, that this is a period of high level of monetization, becomes clearer to us. In terms of Kushana military organization, I have talked about it earlier too, but here I want to make a reference to Kushana sculptures, especially those at Khalchayan Heights, which is there in Afghanistan, that Central Asian area, which actually celebrate the martial elements of Kushana polity. And as mentioned earlier, the cavalry was a very important unit of Kushanas, and for Kushanas, the offices of Dandanayak and Mahadandanayak also were very, very crucial. No matter whatever gestures they were extending to people in order to gain acceptance, the fact remained that they were also a little scared, and the rule by Danda and the show of brute force was equally important. Now, in terms of their technology, some scholars say that, of course, they brought in, cavalry there, but were they familiar with other forms of technology? For instance, were they familiar with the stirrup? The sculptures don't give us that idea, but we have references to rope loops, which might have been the precursors to the advanced stirrups and were probably used by Kushanas, and they really help. Use stirrups, and they help for the man sitting on the horse to gain confidence and to gain a kind of unity with the horse. So stirrups would be coming up with the passage of time. Horseshoe would be coming up with the passage of time, but some kind of advancement was already made at this during the Kushana period. Now, again, we are looking at the ways in which Kushanas are trying to make themselves acceptable to the populace at large. The Kushana claim to divine power was accompanied by their unambiguous declaration of the religion that they professed. It could be any, we have the coins to give away their religious leanings. We know about Kushana rulers like taking up the titles of Yabuga or we're talking about Kujala Cadafasus, who calls himself Dharmasthita Dasa, apparently referring to his devotion to Dharma of Buddha. Kanishka had held the fourth Buddhist council in Kashmir, we know about that. But interestingly, his coins also depict Osho and Uma and the bull, even in Greek and Iranian, languages. In spite of their proclaimed devotion to Buddhism or Shaivism, the Kushanas did not adopt a policy of religious persecution. Under their rule, Mathura was a noted center of Brahmanism, Buddhism, and as well as Jainism. Look at the Kushana coins. Friends, once again, we get a sense of, they're extending their patronage to Shaivism. Osho, Uma, bull seen here. Kanishka one's coin has also Buddha on one side and his own figure on the other side. And gradually what we find is that the Kushanas remain very, very strong, but they keep on making efforts to become more assimilative towards people. We can see that effort coming up in their religious policy, but we also see that effort coming up in their world of art. Now the art, if we talk about Kushana assimilative art, it blended the traditions of Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara, influenced by Hellenistic artistic traditions and the more Indian art of Mathura. Kushana art followed the Hellenistic art of, as I mentioned, Gandhara style, where you have pictures, where you have depictions of Buddha, you have depictions of even their own warriors. The trend at Khalachyan that we see the art gives us an idea, as Roland tells us, there is a proximity between the Hellenistic style and what would emerge into the Gandhar style. Look at this picture. This is the UHE prince. His picture in the next picture of Bodhisattva and Gandhar style, they all look very, very similar. But at the same time, it's not just the Gandhar style that they patronize, they also patronize the Mathura style. We can see the Kushana image at Mathura. So in the end, friends, that we can say that if we were to reflect on the unique aspects of Kushana polity, Kushana introduced some very new elements in Indian polity, making gifts for physical and spiritual well-being of the king, starting the royal cult, dual governorship, which was definitely influenced by Scythians. They introduced the office of Mahadandanayak that the Guptas retained, and along with that, they also tried to bring in the cult of the king. And when they tried, they brought in the cult of the king. This was something that did not gain currency in the Indian context, but otherwise we remember Kushana period for a very assimilative culture, for high level of monetization, for an attempt to bring about political solidarity in a period of political fragmentation. Thank you, friends.